There is a version of the Colorado high country built almost entirely for the lift line. A gondola rising through fresh powder toward a ridge glowing pink at first light. A row of heated patio chairs outside a lodge, steam rising off mulled wine, while a fire crackles in a stone pit. Multi-million-dollar homes stacked along a mountainside, their windows angled toward the same postcard view every brochure for the region has used for 40 years. That version of Colorado's ski country is real, and it draws millions of visitors a winter to towns like Aspen, Vail, Telluride, and Breckenridge. But past the last groomed run, beyond the resort boundary rope most skiers never think to look past, the mountains keep doing exactly what they have always done, holding a set of predators most visitors assume belong somewhere else entirely, somewhere more remote, somewhere that isn't 15 minutes from a 5-star hotel. Before we start, if the idea of what moves through the trees just past the chairlift keeps your mind working after the trip is over, go ahead and subscribe. And tell me which mountain town you visited, because the pattern in this story shows up in more of them than people expect. Start with the animal most visitors to Colorado's resort towns will never see, and would be genuinely surprised to learn is likely watching them from a distance on any given evening walk. The mountain lion. Colorado holds one of the largest mountain lion populations of any state in the country, with wildlife officials estimating several thousand animals distributed across the state's forested mountain terrain, concentrated most heavily in exactly the kind of mixed conifer and aspen forest that surrounds nearly every major ski resort in the state. Mountain lions are territorial, wide-ranging, and built by evolution to remain almost entirely unseen, and researchers who study the species in Colorado consistently note that a resident lion can live for years within a few miles of a busy resort town, moving through backyard-adjacent forest at dusk and dawn, without ever being confirmed by a single resident. What makes ski country specifically attractive to the species is not the tourism itself, but the abundant deer population the tourism economy has, somewhat unintentionally helped sustain. Landscaped resort properties, golf courses converted to winter use, and the ornamental plantings surrounding luxury developments all provide reliable, calorie-rich browse for mule deer throughout the shoulder seasons. And mule deer are the primary prey species for Colorado's mountain lions. Wherever the deer concentrate, the lions that depend on them are rarely far behind, following a food source that happens, in this particular case, to sit directly adjacent to some of the most expensive real estate in the American West. Wildlife officers stationed in and around resort communities field a steady, low-level stream of reports every year. A lion crossing a driveway at dusk, tracks discovered in fresh snow along a groomed cross-country trail, a homeowner's outdoor cat that simply never came home. The overwhelming majority of these encounters end exactly as researchers would predict, with the animal moving off without any confrontation at all. But the frequency of the reports tells its own story about how closely the two populations, human and lion, actually overlap across the resort corridor, move slightly higher in elevation and slightly further from town, and the story shifts from an animal that is quietly always there to one whose presence has become considerably rarer and considerably more consequential when it does occur. The grizzly bear. Colorado's last confirmed resident grizzly population was declared extirpated from the state decades ago, following the death of the last known individual in the San Juan Mountains in the early 1980s. An event that effectively closed the book on the species within Colorado's borders for the following 40 years. For most of that period, wildlife officials treated any reported grizzly sighting in the state with the same skepticism reserved for any animal long since declared locally extinct, attributing nearly every report to a large, unusually pale black bear, a species that remains genuinely common throughout Colorado's mountain forests, and does occasionally display coloration that can confuse an inexperienced observer at a distance. But Colorado does not exist in isolation from the grizzly. Populations recovering in neighboring states, Wyoming's greater Yellowstone grizzly population has grown substantially since federal protection began, and wildlife managers have documented a slow, steady southward dispersal of young male grizzlies, pushing out from that core population in search of unclaimed territory. A pattern of movement biologically similar to the long-distance dispersal patterns documented in mountain lions and wolves alike. Wildlife agencies in southern Wyoming and northern Colorado have, in recent years, taken this possibility seriously enough to include grizzly bear identification and safety protocols in official public materials for the first time in decades, an acknowledgement that the animal's presence, while still unconfirmed within Colorado's borders as a resident population, is no longer considered biologically implausible the way it would have been treated as recently as the early 2000s. This uncertainty places Colorado in a position eerily similar to the one Michigan and Minnesota occupied with the eastern cougar before their own confirmed reproduction events. No jurisdiction has confirmed a resident breeding grizzly population in Colorado, and biologists are careful, deliberately so, not to overstate a possibility built largely on dispersal patterns documented in neighboring states rather than direct evidence gathered within Colorado itself. But the same demographic mathematics that eventually forced official acknowledgement elsewhere, a growing, expanding source population immediately to the north, combined with wide-ranging young males biologically driven to search for new territory, keeps the question open in a way it simply was not a generation ago, and now come back down to the elevation where the resort towns themselves actually sit. Because the animal most emblematic of the entire Western wolf reintroduction story has, in the years since Colorado voters approved its return, moved through mountain terrain considerably closer to the ski corridor than many residents initially expected. Following a statewide ballot measure, Colorado Parks and Wildlife began reintroducing gray wolves to the state's western slope, releasing animals into terrain that includes significant portions of the same high country holding the state's major ski resorts. Wolves are highly mobile, capable of covering enormous daily distances across mountainous terrain, and GPS collar data from released and subsequently born animals has shown individual wolves moving through drainage systems and forested corridors that pass within a relatively short distance of several resort communities during at least part of the year, particularly during the animal's own dispersal phases as young wolves search for new territory of their own. The reintroduction has proven considerably more contentious among Colorado's rural and ranching communities than among the ski towns themselves, where the primary practical concern voiced by wildlife officials centers less on any direct threat to visitors, since wolves overwhelmingly avoid direct human contact even more assiduously than mountain lions do, and more on the animal's effect on domestic dogs, which wolves can perceive as territorial intruders in a way they do not typically perceive people. Resort area wildlife officials have folded wolf awareness into the same seasonal messaging already used for mountain lions and bears, advising residents and visitors to keep dogs leashed on backcountry trails and to avoid leaving pets outside unattended overnight in areas where wolf activity has been documented nearby. Taken together, the three animals describe a resort corridor considerably wilder than its own marketing typically acknowledges, a confirmed, thriving, and largely invisible mountain lion population following the deer the tourism economy itself sustains. A grizzly bear presence that remains formally unconfirmed within the state, but is no longer treated as biologically implausible by the agencies responsible for tracking it, and a reintroduced wolf population whose individual animals have, in the years since release, moved through forested terrain, considerably closer to multi-million-dollar ski properties than the original reintroduction. Planning documents necessarily anticipated residents would need to think about day to day. None of this is presented by the wildlife officials, who track it as a reason for alarm, and they are consistent, deliberately and repeatedly in saying so. The overwhelming majority of encounters between any of these three animals and the millions of visitors who pass through Colorado's resort corridor every year end exactly the way the biology predicts, with the animal retreating unseen long before a person ever registers its presence. But the postcard version of the Colorado high country, gondola, powder, fire pit, mulled wine, was never actually empty past the resort boundary rope. It only looked that way because the mountains have always been considerably better at staying out of sight than the marketing behind the towns built into them has ever needed to admit. To understand how thoroughly the mountain lion has embedded itself into the exact terrain surrounding Colorado's resort economy, it helps to look closely at how these developments were actually built rather than how they are marketed. Nearly every major Colorado ski resort sits at the base of a drainage system, a natural funnel of forest and creek corridor descending from higher alpine terrain into the valley floor the town itself occupies. That geography was chosen for the resorts because it makes sense for lift infrastructure and snow retention. But the same drainage corridors that made the terrain attractive to ski area developers were, for millennia before that, the exact travel routes mountain lions used to move between summer and winter ranges, following mule deer migrating along the same elevation gradient. Wildlife researchers who have studied lion movement patterns in developed mountain corridors describe a pattern of behavioral accommodation rather than displacement. Animals that have effectively learned to treat the developed valley floor as a kind of nighttime commons, crossing backyards, golf courses, and open space trail corridors during the hours when human activity drops off, then withdrawing into steeper, less accessible terrain during the daylight hours when the town is at its busiest. This creates a functional, if largely invisible, daily rhythm in which the lion and the resort town occupy the same physical footprint on a rotating schedule, each one mostly absent from the landscape during the other's most active hours. This pattern explains something long-time residents of Colorado's mountain towns describe, with a kind of practiced calm that visitors rarely share. The outdoor cat that goes missing every few years without explanation. The deer carcass discovered half buried under branches near a hiking trailhead. The trail camera image circulated quietly among neighbors rather than reported to any agency, treated less as a discovery than as a mild confirmation of something everyone already generally assumed. Wildlife officers working these communities note that the ratio of confirmed lion activity to actual reported sightings remains consistently low, not because the animals are rare, but because residents who have lived alongside the population for years have largely stopped treating an individual sighting as noteworthy. The grizzly question sits on considerably less settled ground, and it is worth walking through the actual mechanics of how a dispersal event like this would even be detected, because the process illustrates exactly the kind of evidentiary gap that took Michigan and Minnesota's cougar populations more than a decade to close. A dispersing male grizzly moving south out of the Yellowstone ecosystem would, in all likelihood, travel primarily through exactly the kind of remote, roadless high-elevation terrain that borders much of Colorado's northern ski country, moving mostly at night, avoiding roads and developed areas by instinct, and covering enormous daily distances across landscape that receives essentially no systematic wildlife camera coverage outside of the specific research projects biologists have deployed for entirely different purposes, most often mountain lion or elk studies. Under those conditions, a single dispersing grizzly could plausibly move through northern Colorado's high country for an extended period without ever triggering a single confirmed detection. Precisely the scenario wildlife agencies in southern Wyoming have begun preparing residents for through updated identification materials, distinguishing grizzly track and scat characteristics from the more common black bear signs residents are already generally familiar with. Colorado Parks and Wildlife has, for its part, maintained a consistent public position that no resident grizzly population currently exists within the state, while simultaneously acknowledging, in more recent public communications, that an individual dispersing animal passing through northern Colorado at some point in the coming years cannot be entirely ruled out given the documented expansion of the source, population immediately across the state line. This is, functionally, the exact same rhetorical position Michigan's Wildlife Agency held regarding cougars for more than a decade, before a single trail camera photograph in the snow changed the conversation permanently. Individual animals, plausible and biologically unsurprising. A resident, breeding population, unconfirmed and not currently asserted. The gap between those two positions is where the uncertainty genuinely lives, and it is a gap that, history suggests, tends to close eventually, usually all at once, with a single piece of evidence too clear to dismiss. The wolf reintroduction occupies a different category entirely, because unlike the lion's quiet permanence or the grizzly's uncertain possibility, it represents a deliberate, publicly voted, and closely monitored return of a species Colorado's own wildlife agency chose to bring back. That distinction matters for how closely the animal's movements are actually tracked. Released wolves and their subsequently born offspring have, in most cases, been fitted with GPS collars, transmitting location data back to Colorado parks and wildlife on a regular schedule, giving researchers a level of movement detail simply unavailable for the state's lion or hypothetical grizzly populations. That data has already produced findings state wildlife officials describe as broadly consistent with expectations but occasionally surprising in their specifics. Individual wolves covering dozens of miles in a single night, crossing highway corridors, and in several documented cases, passing through forested terrain within a relatively short distance of developed resort area subdivisions during nighttime hours, before continuing on toward more remote territory. Wildlife managers emphasize that these are transit movements rather than any indication of wolves establishing territory near developed areas, consistent with the species' well-documented preference for large, undisturbed home ranges away from concentrated human activity. But the collar data has, in a very literal sense, put a number and a map behind what mountain lion researchers in the same region have long described only qualitatively, confirming that a genuinely wild, wide-ranging apex predator can and does move through terrain considerably, closer to a five-star ski resort than most of that resort's own guests would ever imagine while riding the lift. Resort area wildlife officials, ranching advocacy groups, and the state wildlife agency itself remain in active, sometimes contentious dialogue over how the reintroduction should be managed going forward, particularly regarding compensation for livestock losses in the surrounding ranching communities that share the same mountain corridor with the resort towns. That conflict, largely invisible to the average ski vacationer, is itself a kind of evidence for how real the overlap actually is. A policy fight over an animal whose GPS collar data confirms it is, at least occasionally, moving through exactly the terrain the tourism economy has spent decades photographing as an empty, snow-covered wilderness. What all three species share, in the end, is not a threat level so much as a consistent pattern of underestimation on the part of an industry that sells the mountains as scenery first and habitat only in the abstract, and on the part of visitors who arrive already trained by that marketing to see the terrain past the last groomed run as simply more picture, rather than as the same functioning ecosystem it was before the first lift tower was ever installed. The lion was always there, following the deer the landscaping itself sustains. The grizzly's return remains genuinely uncertain, but considerably less implausible than it was a generation ago, sitting in exactly the evidentiary gap that has, in other states, eventually closed. And the wolf, reintroduced by deliberate public choice, is now confirmed, collar by collar, to move through terrain considerably closer to the postcard than the postcard itself has ever needed to show. The gondola will keep rising through fresh powder at first light, and the fire pit will keep glowing on the lodge patio through the coldest nights of the season. And somewhere past the boundary rope, in the same drainage corridors that shaped where the lift towers themselves were built, the mountains will keep doing what they have always done, holding a population of predators considerably larger and considerably closer than the brochure has ever had any reason to mention. There is a particular hour, just after the lifts stop turning, and just before the town's restaurant lights fully take over from the fading alpenglow, when the resort corridor briefly belongs to neither version of itself completely. The skiers are inside changing out of boots. The night shift hasn't yet fully begun, and somewhere along the same drainage, the lift towers were built beside. The valley quietly changes hands for a few hours, the way it has every single evening, since long before anyone thought to build a gondola over it at all.